Welcome to Reading the Gospels Together for Tuesday, March 31st. Yesterday we read Matthew chapters 1 and 2, and today we'll look at some of the answers to the questions that it raises. First of all, why did Matthew start his gospel with a genealogy? Well, there are several reasons. First, it establishes Jesus as a real person with a real heritage, not a ghostly figure who appears from out of nowhere. Secondly, it establishes Jesus as a descendant of Abraham, with whose name the genealogy starts. Jesus is a Hebrew, a Jew, a descendant of Abraham with whom God made the covenant, "I shall be your God, and you shall be my people." Jesus is the fulfillment of that covenant. Thirdly, it traces Jesus' lineage through the royal line of King David, from which the Messiah would come. This validates everything that Matthew says in the very first. Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Notice also the careful wording of the conclusion of the genealogy in verse 16. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Matthew's careful to point out that Joseph is not Jesus' father. And then he explains how all this came about in his nativity story. Unlike Luke, in Matthew, Joseph is the main character. We see the story from his perspective. The angel visits Joseph in his dreams rather than in person. Notice too that Joseph intends to divorce Mary when he discovers that she is pregnant, even though they're not yet married. In that culture, at that time, an engagement was as binding as a marriage. Matthew quotes the prophet Isaiah. "The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel." Matthew will quote the Old Testament throughout his gospel, pointing out again and again how Jesus, from the moment of the announcement of his birth onwards, is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies and the promise of God to send a Messiah to deliver the people. Joseph was a main character in the nativity story, but then Matthew shifts the camera to a very different person, King Herod, the surprising focus of chapter 2. Herod was consumed with the thought that he would be replaced. Who would take his crown as king? And Jesus is the true king in waiting. Even the visit of the Magi begins in the palace of the evil Herod, who seeks to put an end to this rival to the throne. Notice that the Magi come to Jerusalem to look for the newborn king. It is Herod who sends them to Bethlehem after consulting with his advisors. Matthew tells us that Herod found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. This will eventually lead him to order the deaths of all the baby boys born in Bethlehem in the previous 2 years, an indication that by this time Jesus is no longer a newborn but an infant, perhaps even approaching 2 years old. He's no longer in a manger, but as Matthew points out, in a house. Again warned in a dream, Joseph bundles the family off to Egypt to escape the murderous Herod, where they will remain until Herod's death, which could not have been more than a few years. There were large Jewish communities in Egypt at the time, particularly in Alexandria, where the Holy Family likely settled. When returning to Israel, they discovered that Herod's son Archelaus was ruling in Judea. Archelaus was a murderous chip off the old Herod block, so Joseph is again warned in a dream to not risk settling back in Bethlehem, but instead goes to Nazareth in Galilee where Jesus would grow up. About those women in the genealogy, they're Tamar from Genesis 38, Rahab from Joshua 6, Ruth from, the book of Ruth, and the woman Matthew calls the wife of Uriah. See why he calls her that in 2 Samuel chapter 11. None of these ladies have the kind of backstory you would have heard about in Sunday school, and 2 or more of them aren't even Jewish. In including these 4 women, Matthew is reminding us that Jesus is for everyone, regardless of their heritage, regardless of their story. He's also sending a message that regardless of our past, God can use us to bring Jesus to the world. Today we'll be reading Matthew chapter 3 and 4. In Matthew 3, we'll meet John the Baptist, whom Luke identifies as a cousin of Jesus. John's a tremendously important person in the New Testament, the last of the Old Testament prophets, making yet another bridge between old and new. What kind of picture does Matthew paint of John? After Jesus' baptism, Jesus heads into the rocky, mountainous wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Matthew specifies that Jesus fasted for 40 days and nights. Where else does the number 40 appear in the Bible? Take a good look at the temptations to which Jesus is subjected. Why do you think he was tempted in this way? The latter part of the chapter outlines the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Read Jesus' first sermon in verse 17, then read John's sermon back in verse 1 of chapter 4. Notice any similarity? Finally, Matthew gives us two summaries, the manner in which the disciples were called and their response, and a wonderful summary of the ministry of Jesus. Do you think you would have dropped everything to follow Jesus like the disciples did? Finally, look at the extent of Jesus' ministry. See if you can find these places on a map. That's lots for today. We'll see you tomorrow.